Welcome, and thank you for joining me. This is a calm journey through the art of Claude Monet and the water garden he painted for the last decades of his life. Let's drift into the story of Monet's water lilies, a garden brushed with flowing blues, soft greens, and blossoms of white and pink. But before we begin, I'd love to know where you are tuning in from, and what time it is where you are. Let me know in the comments. Claude Monet was born in 1840 in Paris, with railways stretching across the land and factories rising beside cathedrals and palaces. Photography, still a novelty, was teaching people to see the world in a new way, to capture a moment instantly, rather than through the slow, careful gaze of tradition. In the cities, the official art world was precise, formal, and exacting. Large galleries displayed paintings of historical scenes, classical myths, and grand portraits, often commissioned by wealthy patrons or institutions. The brushwork was polished, the compositions carefully composed, and the rules of perspective and color strictly followed. To many, beauty was orderly and exact, measured in every line and shadow. Though born in Paris, Monet's earliest memories were shaped by the seaside. His family moved to a port town when he was a child, where the horizon stretched endlessly and ships drifted in and out with the tide. It was here that Monet first began to draw. He sketched the people he saw, sometimes the fishermen, sometimes the townsfolk, often with a touch of humor. His portraits were quick, lively, filled with energy. He was just a boy, but already the act of observing, of translating what he saw onto paper had taken hold of him. He often watched the way the waves broke against the shore, how sunlight scattered across ripples, how storms darkened the horizon. From an early age, he was captivated by the way light transforms everything it touches. How a single tree could look golden at dawn, emerald at midday, and violet in the fading dusk. When Monet grew older, he was expected, like many young men, to follow a practical trade. But his heart was already elsewhere. His mother, a singer, supported Monet's dreams of becoming a painter, and thus he traveled to Paris to study art. In the middle of the 19th century, painting was still dominated by tradition. The traditional academies of painting emphasized grand history scenes, noble figures, and carefully polished technique. The most respected works were often vast in scale, carefully composed and filled with subjects from history, mythology, or religion. The ideal of beauty was precise, polished, and formal. Monet's first move to Paris was like stepping into a city of endless possibilities. The streets were alive with the chatter of people, the clatter of carriages, and the hum of distant factories. Even as a young student, he was drawn to the museums and galleries, studying the paintings of the masters with quiet fascination. He spent hours sketching along the Seine, watching the play of sunlight on the water, noticing the subtle differences in tone and shadow as the day passed. Yet city life was also overwhelming at times. Rooms were small, rents were high, and the pace of life often pressed in around him. Also, unlike many artists of his day, Monet was not interested in grand historical scenes or dramatic portraits of kings and generals. He wanted to paint what the eye actually sees, in fleeting instants. wanted to catch the shimmer of sunlight on a river, the haze of mist on a field, the warmth of afternoon on a wall of stone. He was restless with this approach. He preferred to paint outdoors, directly before the subject, letting the freshness of a scene guide his brush. This devotion to light, to its changes, its moods, its colors, would follow him all his life, and it would lead, many years later, to the garden where the water lilies floated. It was during these years that he met other young painters who shared the same spirit of rebellion: Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, Alfred Sisley. These young painters felt restless under those expectations. They were all experimenting, searching for something new. Together, they would one day form the group we now call the Impressionists. They began to set up their easels outdoors, in fields, in gardens, on riverbanks. Instead of sketching quickly and finishing in the studio, they wanted to work directly in the changing air and light. The result was different from anything the public was used to. Instead of carefully blended surfaces, the paintings showed visible strokes, quick touches of color placed side by side. At a distance, those strokes seemed to shimmer into life, like sunlight broken into fragments. Up close, you could see the movement of the brush, the energy of the moment. It was not about capturing objects exactly as they looked, but about the impression they left on the eye. A sunrise, a foggy harbor, the sparkle of water at noon. These things could never be held still, but the artist could capture their feeling. At first, many critics were dismissive. The paintings looked unfinished to them, as though the artists had walked away before completing the details. Some said the canvases were little more than sketches, but there were others who sensed something fresh, something alive. In the 1870s, Monet exhibited a painting of the harbor at sunrise. He called it simply Impression Sunrise. Critics at the time seized on the word impression, using it mockingly, but the name stuck. Though meant as a critique, it became the name of the movement. What was once an insult turned into a badge of identity. The painters embraced it. They were not concerned with polish, but with life itself, with the fleeting beauty of a moment before it slipped away. Among these artists, Monet became one of the central figures. His work seemed to embody the very heart of the movement, the focus on light, the devotion to natural scenes, the willingness to return again and again to the same subject, never tiring of its variations. Where others might have chosen variety, Monet chose depth. He painted haystacks at dawn, at dusk, in frost, in fog. He painted the facade of a cathedral as it glowed in morning light, then again in the pale tones of afternoon, then once more as evening shadows fell. By repeating the same subject under different skies, he showed how the world is never truly the same from one hour to the next. Each moment carries its own atmosphere, its own color, its own emotion. This devotion to the passing instant was at the heart of Impressionism. And for Monet, it reached its fullest expression in the water lilies. They were never just flowers on a pond. They were endless variations of light, shadow, and reflection. But life was not easy for Monet in those years. He faced financial hardship and periods of doubt. There were times when he could not sell his work, times when he worried about supporting his family, his wife Camille and their 2 sons. Thus, after the first stirrings of Impressionism, Monet's life was far from settled. The movement had begun to gain attention, but recognition came slowly. Exhibitions sometimes drew curious crowds, but sales were uncertain. For a painter trying to support a family, this meant constant struggle. There were years when Monet could not pay rent, when he borrowed what he could, when he relied on the help of friends. In these unsettled years, Monet moved often, following both circumstance and inspiration. He painted the gardens of small towns, the bustle of Paris streets, and the quiet calm of the countryside. Sometimes he lived in cramped conditions, barely able to afford paints, yet he sought out subjects wherever he went. He traveled to the coast, where cliffs rose above crashing waves. The sea was a subject he never tired of. Its endless shifts of color, its moods of calm and fury. Standing with his easel near the spray of salt water, he recorded the changing tides, just as he once had as a boy near the harbor. He spent time in cities too, where the smoke of trains and factories caught his eye. In the newly built stations of Paris, he painted steam billowing through iron arches, turning industrial scenes into visions of light and atmosphere. To him there was beauty everywhere light could fall. During these years, Monet was not entirely alone. Other painters who shared his outlook sometimes worked beside him. They encouraged each other, argued, experimented, and hoped for acceptance. Together they arranged their own exhibitions when the official art world refused them. It was a daring choice. Stepping outside the academy, showing their works on their own terms. The risks were high, but so was the sense of freedom. Monet in particular seemed energized by the idea that painting could be liberated from the old expectations. Still, it was a life of constant balance, between hope and discouragement, between breakthroughs and setbacks. The world did not yet see what he saw in his canvases, and patience was required. Monet's personal life during these years was deeply marked by both love and sorrow. When his wife fell ill and eventually passed away, it left Monet devastated. The years surrounding her illness were heavy with worry, and yet, even then, he painted, perhaps as a way to hold on to some sense of continuity, some reminder that beauty remained in the world even in the midst of grief. These experiences shaped him. His brush became more sensitive, his eye more attuned to fleeting moods. Painting was not just a craft, but a way of enduring. Little by little, Impressionism began to be accepted. What had once been laughed at slowly grew in value. Collectors started to take interest, critics began to soften, and paintings that once could not be sold found buyers. Monet himself was still far from wealthy, but the constant pressure eased slightly as the years passed. For the first time, he could imagine settling, building not just a temporary home, but a lasting one. His dreams turned toward stability, toward creating a space where art and life could coexist in harmony. In later chapters of his life, Claude Monet moved to a quiet village in northern France. The house was simple, painted in soft tones, with a garden stretching behind it. At first the garden was filled with flowers planted in rows and beds, irises, roses, tulips. Monet oversaw it all with care, directing the planting and design as though he were arranging one of his canvases. But he had a vision beyond ordinary beds of flowers. Eventually, he bought a piece of land across the road, where a small stream flowed. There he created a pond, curved and irregular, lined with bamboo and willow trees. He even built a small wooden bridge in the style of Japan, a country whose prints and art he admired so deeply. He filled it with water lilies, plants that would become the heart of his final works. The pond was not grand or dramatic. It was modest, quiet, and entirely shaped by his care. Every day he walked outside, tending to the flowers, watching how the light moved across the surface of the water. Standing by the pond, one begins to notice the quiet rhythm of the world. Each ripple on the water appears and vanishes in an instant. Each cloud drifts across the sky and dissolves. The flowers bloom, reach their peak and fade, leaving only the memory of their color. Even the light is never the same from one moment to the next, shifting, softening, fading. There is a gentle lesson in this impermanence. Nothing stays fixed, yet nothing is lost entirely. The reflections of the trees, the lilies floating on the surface, the shadows of birds, all of it moves in patterns too subtle to grasp, yet too beautiful to ignore. In their quiet presence, one can feel the pulse of life itself, delicate, fleeting, but endlessly renewing. Stillness is found not in stopping time, but in noticing it. To linger in a garden, by a pond, or before a painting, is to witness the world as it is moment by moment. The water does not resist the wind, the leaves do not cling to the branches. Everything allows the natural flow, and in that surrender there is calm. Monet often watched his sons wander along the garden paths, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves as he painted nearby, observing the light shift across the pond. He began painting the pond in the late 1890s. At first he painted it like a traditional landscape, trees, flowers, the bridge arching across the water. But gradually he looked closer. He stopped including the horizon. He stopped framing the pond with edges. Instead he focused only on the water and the lilies floating on top. He painted them again and again, in the morning, at noon, and at dusk. The result was hundreds of canvases, some small, some vast, stretching the length of entire walls. Together they became known simply as the water lilies. If you imagine them, you might think of soft floating leaves, rounded patches of green, with blossoms opening in pale pinks and whites. But more than the flowers, what fills the canvases is light. Blues shifting into purples, greens sliding into golds, brush strokes that feel quick but layered, so that the surface is alive even when still. Sometimes the water looks cool and shadowed. Sometimes it is glowing, touched by the brightness of a summer sky. The reflections of trees hang upside down in the water, broken gently by ripples. The water is like a mirror that changes every moment, holding sky and earth together. Monet's garden was alive with the quiet changes of the seasons. In spring, delicate buds unfurled along the banks of the pond. Soft greens appeared on trees and stems, while tulips, irises, and early blossoms added gentle splashes of color. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh leaves, and each morning the light shifted slowly across the new growth. By summer, the garden was full and lush. Water lilies floated across the pond in clusters, their leaves broad and glossy. Sunlight glimmered on the rippling water, turning it into a moving tapestry of blues and greens. Bees and butterflies flitted lazily from flower to flower, and the warmth of the day seemed to linger long into the evening. Monet would walk along the winding paths, pausing often to watch the light drift across petals and pond alike. In autumn, the garden transformed again. Leaves turned golden and crimson, floating gently down to settle on the water's surface. The air was softer, carrying a faint coolness, and the reflections on the pond deepened, touched by the richer muted tones of the season. Even as plants began to fade, Monet found beauty in the quiet melancholy of nature's cycle. When winter arrived, the garden held a hushed stillness. Frost sometimes dusted the edges of the pond, and bare branches traced delicate patterns against the pale sky. The water mirrored the muted light, reflecting the bare trees and the occasional winter sun. Even in the cold and quiet, there was a subtle vibrancy, a sense that life continued beneath the surface, waiting for the return of spring. Through every season, Monet observed patiently, returning again and again to the pond. The lilies, the water, the reflections, and the changing light became a meditation, a way to see the world not as fixed or permanent, but as a flowing, shifting rhythm, beautiful in every moment. One painting from around 1906 shows clusters of lilies in a wide pool. They seem to drift toward one another, like islands slowly floating closer. Another, painted much later, is darker, deep purples and shadows, the blossoms almost hidden. And then there are the great panels that Monet donated to France after the First World War. They curve across oval rooms in the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris. If you were to walk there, you could sit inside a circle of water lilies, surrounded completely, without beginning or end. Monet himself described these works as offering the illusion of an endless whole, of a wave with no horizon and no shore, a place where the eye drifts endlessly, never needing to arrive anywhere. Monet painted the lilies until the end of his life in 1926. Even when his eyesight was failing, he continued. The colors became bolder, heavier, more abstract, yet still filled with movement. For him, the pond was not only a subject, but a world, a universe of reflection, silence, and shifting light. It was, in many ways, his lifelong companion. Monet lived until 1926, painting until the very end. By then, the world had changed greatly since his boyhood by the sea. The Great War had scarred Europe, cities had grown, new art movements were rising. Today, his water lilies hang in museums across the world, inviting viewers into that same quiet world. They are not paintings to be rushed through. They are paintings to dwell in, to wander through, the way Monet wandered through his garden paths. The pond has been there for more than a century. the paintings will remain for centuries more. Like the water itself, his paintings invite us not to arrive, but to drift, to let the eye and mind rest where they will. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.